Well, hey, welcome everyone to this edition of Pop Tech Radio. I am Mike Etchart. So glad to have you here today. We are going to be talking about iTunes. You may have seen the news and the headlines, iTunes going away. It was a great headline. Not exactly true. We're going to talk about what's really happening and what's going on with iTunes. But you know, if you are a fan of digital music or a fan of technology, you've been using iTunes for a very long time, and it's really pretty miraculous that it has stayed in mostly its same incarnation for the last, about 18 years. I want to say that it came about in around 2001, shortly before the introduction of the iPod, and the iPod was revolutionary, and iTunes was a big reason that the iPod was so successful, because it was such a great librarian system. And you know, you've probably heard me talk on the show a fair amount about the fact that, you know, the iPod was not the first digital music player by a long shot. There were digital music players coming out in almost maybe the mid 90s, certainly the late 90s, well before the iPod was introduced. But one of the things they all had in common was they were terrible in terms of just the management of those files, those songs. They were terrible. And, you know, way before digital music happened, I was a big fan of the Walkman. Maybe you remember the Walkman? that was a revolutionary device. That was the first portable music player. And of course, it used cassettes in the day. And then there was, I guess it was called the Discman after that. It was portable DVD players. They didn't work as well in terms of just because of there was, at least I wore them for exercise. But when the original Walkmans and then their clones came out, and this would have been in the mid 80s, I guess, early 80s probably, I was an early adopter and loved it. I spent so much time making mixtapes. I was running a lot then and jogging, and I would make these elaborate mixtapes with different songs and spend all this time of, you know, recording them on a cassette player and then going out and running with them. And it was fantastic. It was absolutely amazing. I love, you know, having that immediate portability when you're exercising at the time, and cassette was the big format in those days, was fantastic. And I was a long time user of that well into the 90s and into the early 2000s. And I never, even though I had a lot of friends that had those early digital music players, my first one was the iPod. But when iTunes was introduced and then the iPod shortly thereafter, it was absolutely revolutionary. And it was great for me creating set lists for exercising, because if I didn't like the first song being the first song in iTunes, I could just slide it down into the fifth song or the eighth song or whatever it was. It was just fantastic. And that first iPod, of course, was really a wonderful device, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the show as well, how much fun we all had in those early days of digital music with iTunes and with the iPod. But now we are getting to a point where where iTunes has really kind of outlived its usefulness, mostly because it does so much now. It's really gotten kind of, I don't know if bloated is the right word, but it's become outdated. It's been asked to do too many things, and what Apple's going to do is they're going to split it up. So it made great headlines for saying how iTunes is going to be discontinued, but the fact is we're going to all be fine, and we're going to move on with our lives, and it's going to still exist in much the same way that it has. It's just going to divide it up into different categories, so to speak. But you know, it's for a piece of software to last 18 years, which is more or less how long it has been lasting, is absolutely revolutionary. So kind of our hats off to Apple, but Apple didn't even develop that. It was developed by another company that Apple ended up buying. But it's been, you know, if you would have told those developers back in the day that, hey, this piece of software will last for 18 years, there's not a person in that room that would have believed that. So it's a huge success that iTunes still exists. I still use it on my computer. I still have a ton of different set lists, and my digital catalog that is there. All of my digital library, I should say, it's all still in iTunes, and it still is working fine, and it's going to be fine when they split it up, and it's going to be divided into music and television and podcasts and other things. So that's fine. But we're going to talk today a little bit more about what's going on at Apple and how kind of the development of iTunes happened, and the iPod, because you can't mention one without the other, and really how revolutionary and eventually evolutionary all of those technologies became. And then we're going to talk a little bit about where we are today with digital music and subscriptions and what's going to be happening in the future. So stick with us. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we've got the story of iTunes. This is PopTech Radio. Be right back.